The moment my parents stood up in the middle of my wedding ceremony and shouted, "We object!" I thought my world was ending. But when my new husband leaned over and whispered 6 words in my ear, I realized my world hadn't ended at all. It had never actually existed. Standing there in my grandmother's vintage lace dress, surrounded by 200 guests in the historic Riverside Manor outside Nashville, I watched my mother's face transform from radiant joy to absolute horror in the span of 3 seconds. My father, normally the most reserved man I'd ever known, was on his feet beside her, his hands shaking as he pointed toward the altar where I stood next to the man I'd just promised to love forever. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. "That man is not who he says he is," my mother called out, her voice carrying across the stunned silence of the chapel. "His name isn't Derek Williams. We have proof." The entire wedding party froze. My bridesmaids, dressed in sage green silk, looked like deer caught in headlights. Derek's groomsmen shifted uncomfortably, and I could hear gasps rippling through the crowd. The officiant, Reverend Matthews, had performed hundreds of ceremonies over 30 years, but his face showed he'd never encountered anything like this. That's when Derek leaned in close, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered the words that changed everything. "They're absolutely right. I'm sorry, Madison." But to understand how we got to that moment, how my perfect fairy tale wedding turned into a nightmare in front of everyone I loved, I need to take you back 8 months earlier, to the night I met the man who would become my husband at a charity gala in downtown Memphis. It was October, and the Palmer Foundation's annual fundraiser was in full swing at the historic Peabody Hotel. I was there representing the marketing firm where I worked, networking with potential clients and trying to look sophisticated while balancing a champagne flute and a tiny plate of hors d'oeuvre. The ballroom was filled with Memphis society. Business leaders, philanthropists, and young professionals, all dressed to impress under glittering chandeliers that had witnessed decades of similar gatherings. That's where I first saw him, standing near the silent auction tables, studying a painting with genuine interest, rather than just trying to see and be seen like most of the other guests. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair that looked effortlessly styled and kind brown eyes that crinkled slightly at the corners when he smiled. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit that suggested success without being flashy, and there was something about his posture that conveyed confidence without arrogance. When he caught me watching him, he smiled and walked over with the kind of easy grace that made my stomach flutter. "I'm Derek," he said, extending his hand. "Derek Williams. I don't think we've met." "Madison Parker," I replied, immediately struck by his warm handshake and the way he maintained eye contact without making it feel intense or uncomfortable. "Are you thinking about bidding on the landscape piece?" "Actually, yes. It reminds me of a place I used to visit as a child in Colorado. There's something about mountain views that puts life in perspective, don't you think?" We talked for 2 hours that night, standing in various corners of the ballroom as the crowd shifted around us. Derek told me he was a project manager for a renewable energy consulting firm, that he'd moved to Memphis 6 months earlier for work, and that he was still getting to know the city. He asked thoughtful questions about my job in marketing, wanted to know about my favorite restaurants and hidden gems in Memphis, and had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. He had traveled extensively for work, mentioning projects in Colorado, Wyoming, and New Mexico, with the kind of specific details that made the stories come alive. He spoke passionately about sustainable energy and environmental conservation, but not in a preachy way, more like someone who had found genuine purpose in his career. When I mentioned my volunteer work at the local animal shelter, his eyes lit up with interest, and he shared stories about the golden retriever he'd had growing up on his family's small ranch in Colorado. By the end of the evening, Derek had asked for my number, and I'd said yes without hesitation. There was something magnetic about him, something that made me want to know more about his stories, his work, his dreams for the future. As I drove home that night, I found myself smiling and replaying our conversation, already hoping he would call soon. Our first official date was dinner at Flight Restaurant, an upscale spot overlooking the Mississippi River that I'd mentioned loving but rarely being able to afford on my marketing coordinator's salary. Derek arrived exactly on time, bringing me white tulips because he'd remembered me mentioning they were my favorite during our conversation at the gala. He had researched the restaurant's history so he could tell me interesting stories about the building's past as a cotton warehouse, and he'd even called ahead to request a table by the window so we could watch the riverboats passing by as the sun set. The conversation flowed effortlessly from the moment we sat down. Derek talked about his passion for sustainable energy, describing solar farm projects in ways that made renewable technology sound like poetry. He shared his love of hiking and photography, showing me stunning landscape photos on his phone that he'd taken during consulting trips to Colorado and Utah. He spoke about his goal of eventually starting his own consulting business, helping smaller communities transition to sustainable energy sources. He asked about my dreams of running my own marketing agency someday, listening intently as I described my vision of working with small businesses and nonprofits to tell their stories. When I mentioned my close relationship with my parents and my weekly family dinners, he smiled and said he envied that kind of family connection. He asked about my volunteer work with local animal shelters, and his questions showed he'd remembered every detail I'd shared at the gala. Everything felt natural, comfortable, like we'd known each other for years instead of days. When Derek walked me to my car that night, he didn't try to rush into a goodnight kiss or push for a second date immediately. Instead, he simply said he'd had a wonderful time and hoped we could do it again soon. The gentlemanly approach made me respect him even more. Within 3 months, we were spending most weekends together. Derek integrated seamlessly into my life and social circle with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. He got along wonderfully with my friends, remembering their names and personal details after meeting them just once. He charmed my parents during family dinners, arriving with flowers for my mother and engaging my father in conversations about everything from current events to weekend basketball games. He even won over my notoriously protective older brother Jake during a weekend fishing trip to Reelfoot Lake. Jake had been skeptical of Derek at first, subjecting him to the kind of subtle interrogation that had intimidated previous boyfriends. But Derek handled it with good humor and genuine interest, asking Jake about his work as a paramedic and sharing stories about wilderness first aid training he'd received for his consulting work in remote locations. My mother frequently commented on how polite and respectful Derek was, how he always offered to help in the kitchen during family gatherings, and sent handwritten thank you notes after dinner invitations. She loved how he listened to her stories about her garden and asked thoughtful follow-up questions about her prize-winning roses. My father appreciated Derek's knowledge of current events and his thoughtful opinions on everything from local politics to Memphis Grizzlies games. Derek's integration into Memphis society was nothing short of flawless. At dinner parties, he discussed renewable energy projects with the kind of technical knowledge that impressed my father's engineering friends. He could speak knowledgeably about photovoltaic systems, wind turbine efficiency, and energy storage solutions without sounding condescending or overly academic. When my father's colleague asked about specific challenges in grid integration, Derek provided detailed answers that demonstrated both technical expertise and real-world experience. He volunteered at the same animal shelter where I worked every Saturday morning, charming the staff with his gentle way with rescue dogs, and his willingness to tackle the less glamorous tasks like cleaning kennels and organizing supply closets. The shelter director, Mrs. Henderson, frequently commented on how natural Derek was with the animals, especially the more traumatized rescues who typically took time to trust new volunteers. When my college friends visited from out of town, Derek remembered their names, their jobs, even their pets from previous conversations. He asked my friend Sarah about her law school applications and offered to connect her with an environmental lawyer he claimed to know in Colorado. He remembered that my friend Katie was planning a destination wedding and researched sustainable tourism options for her honeymoon. His attention to detail made everyone feel valued and remembered. My best friend Lucy was completely smitten with Derek after he spent an entire evening helping her move apartments. "He's like a romance novel character come to life," she gushed over brunch the next weekend. "Handsome, successful, and actually listens when you talk. Plus, he carried my couch up 3 flights of stairs without complaining once and bought pizza for all the volunteers." My parents absolutely adored him. Derek would arrive early to family dinners to help my mother cook, discussing her garden with genuine interest and asking thoughtful questions about my childhood that showed he truly wanted to understand who I was and where I came from. He knew that my mother had grown up on a farm in rural Tennessee and loved hearing her stories about raising chickens and growing vegetables. He asked to see photo albums and seemed genuinely interested in learning about our family history. He and my father bonded over weekend basketball games, both college and NBA. Derek knew enough about sports to hold intelligent conversations without being one of those men who dominated every discussion with statistics and trivia. He never missed sending handwritten thank you notes after every gathering, something my mother treasured in an age of text messages and emails. Even my cynical brother Jake, who'd made previous boyfriends feel like they were undergoing FBI interrogation, gave Derek his stamp of approval. Finally, someone who doesn't seem intimidated by Dad's questions, Jake told me after Derek's first family barbecue. And he actually knows how to tie proper fishing knots. Plus, he didn't act like helping with yard work was beneath him. Derek's work life seemed equally impressive and well-established. He traveled occasionally for renewable energy conferences, bringing back interesting stories about innovative solar projects in Arizona and wind farms in Wyoming. He spoke knowledgeably about federal energy policies and could discuss the technical challenges of transitioning rural communities to sustainable power sources. His business cards were elegantly designed with the logo for Pinnacle Energy Solutions, and he carried a professional leather portfolio filled with what appeared to be project specifications and client proposals. His apartment in the trendy Cooper Young neighborhood was tastefully furnished with professional photography of mountain landscapes that he claimed to have taken during consulting trips to Colorado and Utah. The photos were stunning, sweeping vistas of snow-capped peaks, golden aspen groves, and dramatic desert sunsets that showcased real artistic talent. He had a small home office with multiple monitors and technical manuals about renewable energy systems that suggested serious professional commitment. The wedding planning revealed even more of Derek's thoughtful nature and attention to detail. He insisted on meeting with our florist personally to ensure the arrangements matched my vision perfectly, taking notes about which flowers were in season and which would photograph best. He researched the reception menu extensively, making sure we had options for my vegetarian cousin Emma and my uncle's gluten sensitivity. He even learned to waltz properly for our first dance, taking lessons secretly for 2 months so he could surprise me with his improved skills. Derek suggested vendors with impeccable reputations and always seemed to know exactly the right questions to ask. When we met with photographers, he inquired about their backup equipment and contingency plans for bad weather. When we tasted cakes, he remembered that I'd mentioned loving lemon desserts during one of our early dates and made sure the baker included lemon filling options. He was incredibly patient during the inevitable wedding planning stress, offering foot rubs after long days of venue visits and bringing me coffee when I was up late addressing invitations. He seemed genuinely excited about our future together, talking about honeymoon plans and the house we might buy someday with the kind of enthusiasm that made my heart race with anticipation. But looking back now, there were small inconsistencies I'd brushed aside in the glow of new love and wedding excitement. Derek never talked about specific coworkers by name, despite supposedly managing large teams on complex renewable energy projects. When I asked about his colleagues, he'd mention the engineering team, or our lead consultant, but never personal details or workplace relationships that most people naturally share. His business cards were elegant and professional, but the company website was oddly minimal for a firm that supposedly handled million-dollar infrastructure projects. The office address led to a modern building in downtown Memphis, but when I suggested surprising him with lunch one day, he explained that the office was in a secure building with strict visitor policies that made impromptu visits impossible. When my father asked about Derek's company's recent projects during a family dinner, Derek's answers were knowledgeable and detailed, but somehow oddly general. He could discuss the technical challenges of installing solar arrays in mountainous terrain, but when pressed for specific project locations or client names, he'd cite confidentiality agreements and change the subject smoothly. These small discrepancies never felt significant enough to worry about, especially when everything else about Derek seemed so perfect. He was attentive without being clingy, successful without being arrogant, and seemed to love my family almost as much as I did. In the whirlwind of wedding planning and the excitement of being with someone who felt like my perfect match, it was easy to dismiss minor inconsistencies as unimportant details. The first real warning sign came 3 months before the wedding, though I didn't recognize it as such at the time. My father, who had built his career in corporate finance on thorough research and attention to detail, casually mentioned over Sunday brunch that he'd tried to look up Derek's consulting firm online after Derek had mentioned a particularly interesting solar project in Nevada. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. Strange, Dad said, cutting his pancakes with the methodical precision he brought to everything. Pinnacle Energy Solutions doesn't have much of a web presence for a company that supposedly handles million-dollar infrastructure projects. The website exists, but it's pretty basic. No project galleries, no team bios, no case studies. Most consulting firms in that industry showcase their work extensively. Derek was there for brunch that morning, and he handled my father's observation with the smooth confidence I'd come to expect from him. He explained that boutique consulting firms often maintained minimal web presence to protect client confidentiality, especially when working on projects that involved proprietary technology or sensitive locations. He mentioned that many of their clients were government agencies or utility companies that required strict information security protocols. We actually had to remove our project gallery last year after a client raised concerns about competitive intelligence, Derek said, buttering his toast casually. It's frustrating from a marketing perspective, but client trust is more important than web traffic. The explanation made perfect sense, and Dad seemed satisfied. Derek went on to describe some of the security challenges involved in energy infrastructure consulting, painting a picture of an industry where discretion was valued over publicity. He spoke knowledgeably about federal regulations and the need to protect critical infrastructure information from potential threats. But then my mother noticed something odd while we were addressing wedding invitations together on a rainy Saturday afternoon. Derek's emergency contact information was listed as his, quote, business partner, rather than family members, which struck her as unusual for someone planning to get married. When she gently asked Derek about his parents during a family dinner the following week, his demeanor shifted in a way that was subtle but noticeable. The easy confidence wavered for just a moment, replaced by something that looked like carefully controlled sadness. He explained that he was estranged from his family after a painful falling out several years ago, his voice carrying just enough emotion to make further questions feel intrusive and potentially cruel. It's one of my biggest regrets, Derek said quietly, reaching for my hand across the dinner table. I keep hoping that someday we'll be able to reconcile, but some wounds take time to heal. Madison's family has been such a gift to me. You've shown me what healthy family relationships look like. My parents immediately felt bad for bringing up what was obviously a painful topic. My mother apologized and changed the subject, and my father patted Derek's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity. The explanation made Derek seem more vulnerable and human, and if anything, it made my family love him more for his honesty about difficult personal history. Lucy, who worked in human resources at a large corporation, mentioned something troubling after Derek's company supposedly sent flowers to her office when she was recovering from surgery. She'd been touched by the gesture and wanted to send a proper thank you note to his firm as a professional courtesy. I tried to send a thank you card to his company, she told me over coffee, but the address Derek gave me doesn't match any business listings I can find in Memphis. I checked the Better Business Bureau, the Chamber of Commerce, even Google Maps. The address exists, but it's listed as virtual office space, not a consulting firm. When I brought this up with Derek later that evening, he seemed genuinely surprised by the confusion. Oh, we just moved offices, he said, looking up from his laptop where he'd been reviewing what appeared to be project specifications. I probably gave you the old address by mistake. Corporate relocations are always chaotic, especially when you're trying to maintain client services during the transition. He pulled out his phone and showed me photos of what he said was their new office space, a modern suite with glass conference rooms and motivational posters about renewable energy. The photos looked professional and legitimate, exactly what I'd expect from a successful consulting firm. Derek promised to get Lucy the correct address for her thank you note. My brother Jake, who had initially been Derek's biggest supporter, started paying closer attention during family gatherings and began noticing patterns that bothered him. After a Sunday dinner where Derek had been particularly charming, Jake pulled me aside with concerns that surprised me. "Have you noticed Derek never gets personal calls when he's here?" Jake asked, leaning against his truck in my parents' driveway. "No friends calling to chat? No family checking in? No coworkers calling about urgent projects?" For someone who's been in Memphis almost a year now, he doesn't seem to have built many connections outside your circle. The observation bothered me more than I wanted to admit. Now that Jake mentioned it, Derek's social life did seem to revolve entirely around me and my family. His phone occasionally rang during our time together, but the calls were always brief and business-related. He'd step away to answer with phrases like, "I'll handle that Monday," or "send me the specifications via email," but I'd never heard him have the kind of casual, personal conversations that most people have with friends and colleagues. When I suggested Derek invite some of his own friends to join us for dinner or weekend activities, he always had reasonable explanations for why that wouldn't work. His closest friend from college had moved to California for work. His colleagues at Pinnacle Energy preferred to keep their professional and personal lives separate. The guys he played basketball with at the gym were more acquaintances than close friends. "I'm kind of a private person," Derek explained when I gently pressed the issue. "I've always been better at one-on-one relationships than group dynamics. Plus, I'm so busy with work and spending time with you and your family that I haven't really felt the need to expand my social circle much." 2 months before the wedding, Derek's explanations were becoming increasingly elaborate, though still plausible. When a supposed work conference in Denver was canceled at the last minute, leaving him unexpectedly free for a weekend we'd planned to spend apart, he couldn't quite explain the specifics of why the conference had been postponed. Something about venue issues and scheduling conflicts with keynote speakers, but the details were vague. When I asked to see photos from his consulting projects, partly out of genuine interest and partly because I thought they might make good conversation pieces for our future home, Derek said client agreements prevented him from sharing images that might reveal proprietary information or sensitive locations. "I wish I could show you some of the installations we've worked on," he said, seeming genuinely disappointed. "There's a solar farm in Utah that's absolutely beautiful, panels stretching across desert landscape like mirrors reflecting the sky. But the clients are really strict about documentation and photography. Competitive intelligence is a huge concern in the renewable energy industry." Quote, "These explanations always made sense in isolation, but they were starting to accumulate in ways that felt significant." Derek had an answer for everything, but none of his answers could be independently verified. His life before Memphis remained mysteriously vague, his current work was perpetually confidential, and his social connections outside my family were practically non-existent. The most unsettling incident occurred during a dinner party at my parents' house when Derek excused himself to take what he said was an urgent call from a client. I went to the kitchen to get more wine and overheard part of his conversation through the open window. His tone was completely different from the warm, measured voice I was used to. Sharper, more impatient, almost coldly professional. "The timeline needs to move faster," I heard him say. "She's getting comfortable, but her friend is asking too many questions about the company address. We need to accelerate before someone starts digging deeper." When Derek came back inside, his demeanor had returned to normal, and he apologized for the interruption with his usual charm. "Client emergency," he said with a rueful smile. "Sometimes I think people forget that renewable energy projects don't stop for dinner parties." But his words from the phone call echoed in my mind for the rest of the evening. Who was she? What timeline? What friend was asking questions? The conversation I'd overheard didn't sound like anything related to solar panels or wind turbines. My parents' growing unease came to a head 6 weeks before the wedding. My father, who had built his successful career in corporate finance on thorough research and careful analysis, decided he couldn't ignore his mounting concerns any longer. What he initially intended as basic background verification, the kind of due diligence any protective father might do, quickly revealed disturbing inconsistencies that turned his casual investigation into something much more serious. Dad started with simple internet searches, the kind of basic verification that had become routine in the digital age. Pinnacle Energy Solutions existed as a registered business entity in Tennessee, but its incorporation was suspiciously recent, only 7 months old, dated just after Derek claimed to have moved to Memphis. The company had no reported employees beyond Derek himself, no project history with any verifiable clients, and no business relationships with other firms in the renewable energy sector. The office address that Derek had finally provided led to a virtual mailbox service in a downtown Memphis building that rented space to dozens of businesses that existed primarily on paper. The suite number corresponded to a mail forwarding service, not an actual office with conference rooms and engineering teams. When Dad drove by the building during his lunch break, the directory in the lobby showed no listing for Pinnacle Energy Solutions. Dad's investigation expanded as each discovery raised new questions. Derek's LinkedIn profile was professionally crafted and appeared legitimate at first glance, but closer examination revealed troubling gaps. The profile contained no recommendations from colleagues, no detailed project descriptions, and no meaningful connections to actual renewable energy professionals. His educational background claimed a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from Colorado State University. But when my father called the alumni office, they had no record of Derek Williams graduating in the claimed year. The most alarming discovery came when Dad decided to verify Derek's claimed work history. The previous companies listed on Derek's resume either didn't exist, had no record of employing him, or had been dissolved years earlier. References provided phone numbers that led to disconnected voicemail boxes or automated services that couldn't verify employment history. My mother, meanwhile, had been dealing with her own growing anxiety about Derek that she'd initially attributed to normal pre-wedding jitters. But her maternal instincts were screaming that something was fundamentally wrong, and she'd reached the point where she couldn't dismiss her concerns as overprotective paranoia. Against my father's initial objections, she decided to hire a private investigator to conduct a proper background check on the man who was about to become their son-in-law. The PI's preliminary report arrived exactly 1 week before my wedding, delivered in a manila envelope that my mother opened with trembling hands in their kitchen while I was at my final dress fitting. What she read made her physically ill and forced her to sit down at the kitchen table to absorb the full implications of what they'd discovered. Derek Williams had only existed as a legal identity for 8 months. Before that, the same man had lived in Portland, Oregon, under the name David Wright, and before that, Daniel Wheeler in Phoenix, Arizona. Each identity was carefully constructed with legitimate documentation, suggesting someone with sophisticated knowledge of how to create convincing false personas. Each identity lasted approximately 18 to 24 months and followed a remarkably similar pattern. The man would establish himself in a new city with a plausible professional background, usually in fields that were technical enough to discourage casual verification but respected enough to suggest success and intelligence. He targeted successful women in their late 20s to early 30s, always professionals with strong family relationships and significant social connections. The investigator had tracked down 2 of Derek's previous victims through public records and online forums, where women shared stories about romance scams. Both women had strikingly similar experiences: chance meetings at upscale social events, rapid courtship characterized by intense attention and apparent perfect compatibility, seamless integration into family and social circles, and then sudden, unexplained disappearances right around the time serious financial commitments or major life changes were being discussed. Neither woman had lost significant money, which initially puzzled the investigator, until he realized that Derek's con was more sophisticated than typical romance fraud. He wasn't after immediate financial gain through fake emergencies or investment schemes. Instead, he was building long-term access to social and professional networks, using his victims' trust and connections to establish credibility for future cons, or to gain access to business opportunities through their families and friends. The investigation revealed that Derek had never actually worked in renewable energy, despite his convincing technical knowledge. His expertise came from extensive online research, careful observation of industry professionals at networking events, and possibly formal training in social engineering techniques. He was essentially a professional boyfriend, someone who had made a career out of infiltrating the lives of successful women and their families. The most disturbing aspect of Derek's operation was how genuine his emotional manipulation appeared to be. According to the investigator, this wasn't someone who was coldly extracting resources and moving on. Derek seemed to actually fall in love with the lives he infiltrated, genuinely caring about his victims and their families, while simultaneously deceiving them in fundamental ways. He was like an actor who had become so immersed in his role that he'd begun to believe his own performance. The investigator found evidence that Derek often struggled with the decision to abandon his false identities, sometimes extending his cons beyond their planned duration, because he'd grown attached to the people he was deceiving. In Portland, David Wright had delayed his disappearance for 3 months, apparently wrestling with genuine feelings for the woman he was manipulating. In Phoenix, Daniel Wheeler had left behind a storage unit full of personal items and photographs, suggesting he'd been reluctant to completely sever ties with that fabricated life. My parents spent a sleepless night reviewing the investigator's report, trying to process the reality that their beloved future son-in-law was a complete fabrication. They felt betrayed, foolish, and terrified about how to protect me from a truth that would devastate me just days before what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Dad was furious with himself for not trusting his initial instincts about the gaps in Derek's background. Mom was heartbroken at the thought of the pain this revelation would cause me, but she was also angry that someone had manipulated her family's love and trust so thoroughly. They debated whether there might be some mistake, some explanation, that could reconcile the evidence with the Derek they thought they knew. But as they talked through the past 8 months, too many pieces fell into place. Derek's evasiveness about his work, his lack of personal relationships outside our family, his perfect responses to every question, his almost supernatural ability to be exactly what each person needed him to be. The man they'd welcomed into their family was a professionally crafted illusion, and they were faced with the impossible task of destroying their daughter's happiness to save her from an even greater devastation. The decision to confront Derek publicly at the wedding was agonizing. They considered pulling me aside privately, but they worried that Derek would disappear if he sensed the truth was coming out, leaving me with no closure and potentially putting other women at risk. They also realized that Derek's manipulation had been so complete that I might not believe the evidence without seeing his reaction to being exposed. My parents arrived at the Riverside Manor on the morning of my wedding carrying a folder of evidence they prayed they'd never have to use, hoping against hope that somehow Derek would prove them wrong, that there would be an explanation that would preserve my happiness and their faith in their own judgment. The morning of my wedding was everything I dreamed it would be. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the bridal suite at Riverside Manor, where my bridesmaids and I were getting ready with champagne mimosas and excited chatter. The florists had outdone themselves with the sage green and ivory arrangements, and the photographer was capturing every moment of what felt like the perfect beginning to my new life. My parents arrived early to help with final preparations, but I was too caught up in the excitement to notice the tension in their faces, or the way they kept glancing at each other with expressions that didn't match the celebratory mood. Mom helped me with my grandmother's vintage pearl necklace while Dad made small talk with the groomsmen, but there was an undercurrent of anxiety that I attributed to normal wedding day nerves. Derek looked devastatingly handsome in his charcoal gray tuxedo, and when he saw me in my dress during our first look photos, his emotional reaction seemed completely genuine. Tears actually came to his eyes as he told me I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, and for a moment I felt like the luckiest woman in the world. The ceremony was held in the manor's historic chapel, with its soaring ceilings and stained glass windows creating the fairy tale atmosphere I'd always imagined for my wedding day. 200 guests filled the wooden pews, representing both sides of what I thought was our combined life. My family, friends, and colleagues mixed with the smaller group of people Derek had invited, who I now realize were probably casual acquaintances rather than close friends. As I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, I felt overwhelmed with happiness and gratitude. Derek waited for me at the altar with a smile that seemed to light up the entire chapel, and when Dad placed my hand in Derek's during the ceremony, I felt like everything in my life had led to this perfect moment. Reverend Matthews began the traditional ceremony with warmth and dignity, speaking about the sacred nature of marriage and the importance of trust and honesty between spouses. The irony of his words would become apparent soon enough. But in that moment, I hung on every word as validation of the love Derek and I shared. When Reverend Matthews reached the part of the ceremony asking if anyone objected to our union, I actually smiled, thinking it was one of those quaint traditions that never actually happened in real life. The question was supposed to be rhetorical, a formality left over from earlier eras when arranged marriages and legal complications might require last-minute interventions. That's when my parents exchanged one final look, took a deep breath, and stood up together. The sound of my mother's voice calling out, "We object!" cut through the chapel like a physical blow. The gasps from the crowd were audible as 200 people turned to stare at my parents, who stood in the front row looking pale but determined. My bridesmaids behind me made small sounds of shock, and I could feel the entire wedding party freezing in place. "That man is not who he says he is," my mother continued, her voice stronger now despite the trembling I could see in her hands. "His name isn't Derek Williams. We have proof." The chapel fell into the kind of stunned silence that only comes with complete shock. Some guests pulled out their phones, uncertain whether they were witnessing a family drama, a misunderstanding, or something more serious. Derek's groomsmen looked as bewildered as everyone else, and I realized that they probably knew as little about Derek's real identity as the rest of us. I turned to look at Derek, expecting to see indignation, confusion, or angry denial. Instead, what I saw in his face was something that chilled me to the bone: relief. Not the relief of an innocent man confident that a misunderstanding would be cleared up, but the relief of someone whose exhausting performance was finally coming to an end. Derek's shoulders sagged slightly, and he looked at me with an expression that contained genuine regret, mixed with something that might have been gratitude. Instead of protesting his innocence or demanding explanations, he simply reached for my hand and leaned close to my ear. "They're absolutely right," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs from the crowd. "I'm sorry, Madison. I never meant for it to go this far." Quote. Those 6 words, "they're absolutely right, I'm sorry, Madison," shattered my world more completely than any dramatic denial or angry confrontation could have. In that moment, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the man I'd just married was a carefully constructed lie. The chapel erupted in confused conversation as guests tried to understand what was happening. My father approached the altar carrying a manila folder, his face grim but determined. Derek didn't try to run or protest or explain away the evidence. Instead, he looked out at the crowd of people who had welcomed him into their lives and quietly said, "I never meant to hurt anyone. I just wanted to know what it felt like to be loved for who I could be instead of who I really am." Security arrived within minutes. My parents had alerted them beforehand as a precaution, though Derek made no attempt to flee or resist. As uniformed officers approached the altar, Derek looked back at me one final time with an expression that seemed to contain genuine remorse. "For what it's worth," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet chapel, "getting to know your family was the most real thing I've experienced in years. I fell in love with the life we built together, even though I knew it was based on a lie." As they led Derek away from what should have been our wedding altar, I stood there in my grandmother's dress, holding my bouquet of white roses, trying to process the fact that the man I'd just promised to love forever had never actually existed at all. The aftermath of my non-wedding was unlike anything I could have imagined. 200 guests sat in stunned silence as my parents calmly explained the basic facts. The man I'd planned to marry was a professional con artist who had been living under a false identity, and everything we thought we knew about him was fabricated. Some guests left immediately, unsure how to process what they'd witnessed. Others stayed to offer support, though most seemed too shocked to know what to say. My bridesmaids helped me out of my wedding dress in the bridal suite while I sat in numb silence, trying to understand how my perfect love story had transformed into a nightmare in the span of 10 minutes. The investigation that followed my wedding day revelation was both swift and devastating in its thoroughness. Within hours, law enforcement officials were examining the evidence my parents had compiled, and Derek's carefully constructed identity began unraveling completely. His real name, they discovered, was David Marcus Thompson, and he'd been running variations of this same sophisticated con for over 5 years across multiple states. The scope of Derek's deception was staggering. He wasn't just a man who had lied about his job or exaggerated his accomplishments. He had created an entirely fictional existence from scratch. The renewable energy expertise that had impressed my father and his friends came from months of intensive online research and careful observation of industry professionals at conferences and networking events. He'd essentially earned a graduate-level education in sustainable energy technology for the sole purpose of making his false identity more convincing. Unlike typical romance scammers who targeted victims for immediate financial gain, Derek's operation was far more complex and psychologically sophisticated. He wasn't after quick money through fake emergencies or bogus investment opportunities. Instead, he was building long-term access to social and professional networks, using his victims' trust and family connections to establish credibility and social standing that he could never achieve authentically. The most disturbing aspect of Derek's crimes wasn't the financial manipulation, though that was certainly part of his long-term strategy, but the emotional devastation he left behind. He had perfected the art of becoming exactly what each victim needed him to be, studying their personalities, family dynamics, and personal dreams, until he could mirror them back with uncanny accuracy. The private investigator's expanded report revealed that Derek had been planning to disappear after our honeymoon, but had delayed his exit strategy multiple times because he'd become genuinely attached to the life we'd built together. His feelings for me and my family appeared to be real, even though his identity was completely fabricated. He was like an actor who had become so immersed in his role that he'd begun to believe his own performance, which made his crimes even more psychologically complex. Recovery from this kind of deception proved unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Unlike financial fraud or even physical betrayal, this felt like grieving someone who had died, except the person I was mourning had never actually existed in the first place. I found myself missing Derek's laugh, his Sunday morning pancakes, his gentle way with rescue dogs at the animal shelter, but none of those things had been real. They were all carefully calculated performances, designed to make me fall in love with a fictional character. The hardest part wasn't the embarrassment of being fooled, though that was certainly difficult. The most devastating aspect was realizing that my own judgment had been so completely compromised. Derek hadn't just lied about his job or his family. He had lied about every single aspect of his personality, his interests, his values, and his emotions. I'd fallen in love with a master manipulator's idea of what my perfect man should be. Therapy became essential for processing the complex emotions that came with this kind of betrayal. My counselor helped me understand that Derek's manipulation was sophisticated precisely because it contained elements of genuine emotion. He hadn't just pretended to care about my family. He'd actually grown to care about them while simultaneously deceiving them. The cognitive dissonance of loving someone who had never actually existed was one of the most challenging psychological puzzles I'd ever faced. My family struggled with their own guilt and trauma from the experience. My parents questioned whether they should have spoken up sooner, wondered if their initial acceptance of Derek had made me more vulnerable to his manipulation. Jake felt betrayed that his stamp of approval might have contributed to my false sense of security. Even my friends grappled with the realization that they'd been unwitting participants in validating Derek's fictional identity. But gradually, painfully, we all began to heal and rebuild. I learned that my capacity to love deeply and trust completely wasn't a character flaw, even though it had been exploited. The qualities that made me vulnerable to Derek's manipulation, my willingness to see the best in people, my desire to build genuine connections, my openness to love, were also my greatest strengths as a human being. My parents' courage in speaking up at my wedding, despite knowing it would cause me immediate pain, ultimately saved me from years of deeper deception and potentially devastating financial or legal consequences. Their willingness to be the villains in my story to protect me from greater harm was the truest expression of parental love I'd ever experienced. Derek was eventually sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for identity fraud, wire fraud, and a pattern of crimes that crossed state lines. The investigation revealed at least 6 other women who had been targeted with similar schemes, though most had discovered the deception before reaching the altar. I never spoke to Derek again after that day in the chapel, but I learned through legal proceedings that he expressed what appeared to be genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused. A year and a half later, I'm rebuilding my life with hard-won wisdom and a deeper appreciation for authentic relationships. I'm more cautious in romantic situations, but not cynical. I've learned to pay attention to inconsistencies instead of explaining them away, and to value friends and family who ask difficult questions out of love rather than judgment. The experience taught me that real love doesn't require you to ignore your instincts or doubt your own perceptions. Healthy relationships are built on truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable or imperfect. The most important lesson from my almost marriage isn't about spotting red flags, though that's certainly valuable. It's about trusting the people who love you enough to speak uncomfortable truths, even when those truths might temporarily hurt. I still volunteer at the animal shelter where Derek and I used to work together, though it took months before I could walk through those doors without feeling overwhelmed by memories of our Saturday mornings there. Mrs. Henderson, the shelter director, still asks about me occasionally, and I've learned to respond simply that Derek and I didn't work out, without feeling obligated to explain the full complexity of what happened. My family has grown closer through this experience, bonded by our shared trauma and our collective commitment to healing. We've learned that protecting each other sometimes means being willing to cause short-term pain to prevent long-term devastation. Sunday family dinners feel more precious now, more intentionally grateful for the authentic love and genuine connection we share. I'm dating again, carefully and with clear boundaries, but I'm not bitter or closed off to the possibility of real love. If anything, experiencing such a complete fabrication has made me better at recognizing authenticity when I encounter it. I know what fake perfection looks like now, which makes me more appreciative of genuine imperfection. The most profound realization from this experience is that some people are so damaged that they can only connect with others through elaborate deceptions, creating fictional versions of themselves because they don't believe their real selves are worthy of love. Derek's crimes were inexcusable, but they also represented a profound tragedy. A man so disconnected from his own authentic identity that he could only experience love by stealing it through manipulation. Real love, I've learned, sometimes means being willing to be the person who speaks the truth when everyone else wants to believe a beautiful lie. My parents could have stayed silent and avoided the drama of objecting at my wedding. Instead, they chose the harder path of protecting me from a deception that could have destroyed not just my happiness, but my entire sense of reality. And sometimes, the most devastating lies are told by people who have convinced themselves they're true, by individuals who want so desperately to be loved that they create elaborate fantasies, rather than do the difficult work of becoming genuinely lovable. The saddest part of Derek's story isn't that he was a criminal, but that he was a person so afraid of being truly known that he chose to live as a beautiful lie, rather than risk being loved for who he really was. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.